This is the Cloud Security Today podcast, where leaders learn how to get cloud security done. And now your host, Matt Chiodi.
Cybersecurity and resilience. Where do those two come together? And if you've been paying attention to what's happening in the United States, earlier in 2022, there was a proposed cybersecurity rule that came from the Security and Exchange Commission. And there was a lot of talk in the industry. So I wanted to find the best possible guest, and I thought of none other than Chris Hetner. Chris has been around the SEC as both a special advisor to them, to the chair, also to the National Association of Corporate Directors, the NACD. This is someone who is well steeped in regulatory, but also truly understanding cybersecurity risk as it relates to the business. I can tell you that this is an area that I actually did not know a lot about, and I took a ton of notes during the interview. One of the things as a cybersecurity professional that I've always aspired to was to translate the technical to the business. But honestly, I don't think I was very good at it. And with this podcast, we really dive into what are the things that a board cares about, right? You don't want it to just be talking about the number of patches and vulnerabilities to a board, because they don't really understand what that means from a risk perspective to the overall business. So this is one of those things that Chris is going to cover off extremely well. So get your notepad ready and listen as Chris talks about resiliency, cybersecurity, and the recently proposed SEC cybersecurity rules. Chris, welcome to the show.
Hey, Matt, how are you?
I'm doing well. I'm glad you could join us.
Yeah, glad to be here.
So I'm excited to talk to you because I'll be honest, what we're going to be talking about is a lot of cybersecurity, regulatory type things, and that is not an area that I know a lot about. So I'm super excited to have you on because I know you are an expert in this area. You've got a long, accomplished career from your time as CISO at GE Capital to your time at the SEC as a Senior Cybersecurity Advisor to the chairman. So with that kind of context, I like to start out with digging into, people's background, right? How they got to where they are. So you've done a lot, right? Even if we just talk about the last probably 10 years, if you had to pick maybe 2 or 3 things out that you're really proud of, that, that just these are things that they move the needle, what would they be? What would you focus on?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Matt. So the last couple of decades mostly focused on technology risk management and what we now call cybersecurity across the financial services sector. So early on, one of the biggest accomplishments was to achieve some level of hands-on experience in terms of building out cybersecurity programs, hands-on keyboard as relates to deploying network security technology platforms such as firewalls, intrusion detection systems, SIM platforms, building security operations centers for, we'll call it data center operations in support of mostly Wall Street firms. So I built out a couple of data centers in the New York tri-state area that created a geographical dispersion and diversity for most of the firms in Lower Manhattan, and this became even more of a point of focus post 9/11 when companies were thinking about redundancy. So, that was a key component in my career, and I advise many students, whether it's in high school or in undergraduate degree programs that are looking to pursue a career in cybersecurity. You want to develop that muscle. Pick a technological platform, whether it be, programming, application security. In my instance, it was deploying network security infrastructure devices. So it was mostly a Cisco power network. We had about 500 firewalls under management, intrusion detection systems, packet analysis, working the what we call the stack in terms of layer 1, 2, 3, the DOSI model, and build that as a foundation. Get comfortable with that technology, and then from there, you can either continue down the technology path and continue to stay there, or you can shift to more of a program related role, which is kind of the second portion of my career, where I was running information technology risk and information security, what we now call cybersecurity, across some large banking platforms. I spent 5 years at Citigroup running technology risk and cyber for their corporate investment bank, very closely aligned to regulatory requirements, given the focus they had on whether it be the OCC, the Fed, the FDIC, large global bank. And with that, you develop a new set of capability as a cybersecurity professional, because you've really got to understand how the business operates and really get in tune with profit generation, what risks they're willing to take, understanding how they expand the business through mergers, acquisitions, and the integration of information security into their business process. And then you start to unpack, okay, so here's where the most prevalent risks or threats are going to manifest, and how do we apply defenses and controls in such a way where the business shows an appreciation. So I did that kind of hands-on business risk, cybersecurity programming. My time at Citigroup, then I switched to GE Capital, where I was the global CISO, leveraged many of those learnings through Citigroup. And GE Capital was a about $500 billion financial institution comprised of a commercial bank and a consumer banking platform. We operated across 60 countries, about 100,000 employees, tens of thousands of suppliers.
Massive.
I always joke that's where I lost all my hair as a global CISO. And there it was continuation of the intersection of information technology and the treatment of cyber risk and business risk to drive resiliency. But the other facet of that role was, hey, now that we're under the supervision of the Federal Reserve Bank, we've got to make sure that our programs and our policies run consistently across the globe. And we, within a 2-week period, we had about 40 Fed examiners move into our headquarters. Just to,
Wow.
They're living, So that created a whole new set of muscle in my career around just appreciation of cyber intersection with business risk and resilience and regulatory. And then kind of the third, which was most of my time spent within the U.S. government, working as senior advisor to the Securities Exchange Commission chair, the chair's office. I worked directly under Mary Jo White and Jay Clayton, and kind of leveling up how we think about cybersecurity across the United States securities market, which is about $60 trillion market. Again, tens of thousands of firms. How do we inform our policies, rulemaking activities? How do we think about examination prioritization? How do we think about enforcement actions if an institution violates or doesn't meet certain requirements? And most of that work that was leading was underpinned based on leveraging threat intelligence, whether it be from the commercial sector or from the intelligence community, understanding where you have pockets of systemic risk, learning from our examinations and our evaluations of how well these firms are operating, and then working across other agencies such as DHS and U.S. Treasury, FBI, the intelligence community, on creating a kind of a consolidated approach where you're consistently bringing in data to help suppress some of those risks and driving what we call financial services resiliency to make sure that we're able to recover in sufficient time. So those are kind of 3 big strokes throughout the last couple decades, and now back in the private sector, kind of pulling it all together in the boardroom community. Kind of think about my role now north of the CEO. So we work very close with the CEO of companies, the boardroom, on pulling this all together, which actually aligns very, very nicely with the new regulations that will be coming down the pike from the SEC and others.
So let's talk about that. So from a regulatory perspective, like here in the US, in March of 22, there was a new rule that was proposed, and then there was a whole flurry of discussion in the industry. Give us a summary. What was actually proposed?
So what's proposed is a build upon, or I would say anchored on, what we delivered in 2018, which was what we called the Cybersecurity Disclosure Interpretive Guidance. And it was exactly what it is. It was guidance. It wasn't a hard, fast rule. But what's being proposed now is to take many of the principles that I was responsible for back in the prior chair's office and level it up to now become more of an enforceable rule. It's viewed through the U.S. court systems as a strengthened requirement. It creates further strength in terms of class action litigation, holding executives accountable. I'd say the core components of this new requirement is, number one, determining the incident disclosure within 4-day requirement based on materiality. So once the incident happens, you have determined materiality, and then once you determine it's material to your business, you've got 4 days to disclose. Now, materiality could take from a week to months to determine the size, complexity, and the new chair and the leadership there, they understand that there's a lot of complexity with that. The other piece of the rule is just the traditional blocking and tackling of a cybersecurity program. You must have a written cybersecurity policy. You've got to have the board level engagement in terms of understanding where those key risks are. Policies and procedures around incident reporting. You can't just be, hey, we're just going to fly blind when an incident occurs. It should be documented and codified and ratified by the enterprise risk management organization. And then there's another component of the rule that talks about quote unquote board level expertise. So to what extent do you have a cyber expert on the board? Or if not, how are you addressing cybersecurity in the boardroom? Is it a dedicated committee? Are you hiring an outside expert? How are you ensuring that you have that level of competency in the boardroom that's being addressed from a cybersecurity standpoint, and disclose exactly how that would occur. The other dimension, I would say, beyond the incident requirement for disclosure, is kind of what I would call left of boom, which is disclosure of your cyber risks. So it's analogous to going visit the cardiologist to say, hey, we just did a cardiac scan to detect calcification around my core arteries, and I found 80% blockage in one of my arteries. To me, I view that as a fairly material risk. Now, I haven't, thank God, realized a heart attack, but probably something that needs to be addressed through treatment, whether it be medication, stent, diet, exercise, stop smoking, et cetera, that type of material risk, flip it or apply that cyber lens to your organization, also needs to be understood, and needs to be understood through the lens of what we call unaddressed cyber risk. You've got technology debt. You've got employees that have heightened administrative access. Maybe you're operating in a geographical region that will likely present risk. So, how is that risk being addressed, and how are you disclosing that as part of your flow up into an engagement with the enterprise risk management organization and the board of directors. So those are kind of the broad stroke areas that's really contained within this rule. And then I could talk about a little more detail in terms of how that's unpackaged.
When I read what was proposed, one of the things that stood out to me was, and you mentioned this as well, which says the word material. Is there an accepted definition of what would trigger that?
Well, it's keep in mind materiality. It's fairly legal term, so it's written by lawyers in the SEC, and I could tell you from the rule and what's been written about this, the the public listed companies contained within the proposal, listed companies are required to report, again, within the 4 days once an incident is deemed quote unquote material. And the material determination is influenced by a couple of factors. Number one, what's the impact to the business? So, a hospital that realizes a ransomware event is going to look different than a ransomware event impacting a manufacturer. It's a little different than a data breach impacting, let's say, a bank or financial services firm. So it's got to be very business specific. 2, what's its impact to its operations? So if you're a publicly listed company, you have a ransomware attack, your manufacturer takes down a core portion of your ability to produce product. Suddenly, you have potential for a business interruption. You're unable to produce product, which means that it's going to impede on sales. Which leads us to the third component, which in our opinion, in the legal community and in the what we'll call in the accounting community, if you look at accounting principles, it's really impact on the financial condition of the firm. And this is what we call the so what factor, aka materiality. And the financial condition is really about impact to specific factors. And I can actually walk through some of the types of costs and adverse consequences that companies may incur or experience as a result of a material cybersecurity incident. So I'm thinking through for your audience, if you've got a cybersecurity program, you have a series of incidents that occur perhaps on an hourly basis, daily basis. My concern with the cybersecurity industry, where we stand now, is the current ecosystem, whether it's on endpoint detection all the way through security operations center, security monitoring, is largely focused on technical level threats used to inform measures to inform risk. So this could be, hey, I've got an IP address moving laterally on my network. That's abnormal. Or have a user that's accessed the system at midnight that shouldn't be accessing the system. Or we've seen some points of network telemetry that seem abnormal. And the problem that we have with the current ecosystem, it still lacks the ability to apply what we call business, operational, financial context to these cyber threats. So as I would advise your audience and how I advise boards of directors on this topic is to contemplate these costs due to a business interruption, such as decrease in production, delays in product launches. Contemplate the payments to meet the ransom or the extortion demands. And by the way, ransomware extortion or payment on the ransom is relatively insignificant relative to the overall cost of the event. Right. One of the points listed in the proposed rule is what are the costs around remediation, such as stolen assets, information, perhaps it's intellectual property, perhaps it's R&D that you spent tens of millions of dollars on, keep it protected within the 4 walls of your company to inform a new product release. Now, an adversary has siphoned that data, and suddenly your IP is now public domain, and that puts you in a severe disadvantage. And if I was a shareholder, and I know that you as a company are producing a product that's differentiated, which means that your market share is going to increase, which means your stock value is going to increase, and suddenly it's open domain. That could represent some problems in terms of depreciation of value. But there's also other costs like remediation to systems, replacing systems. What if you have to create incentives to retain customers or business partners in order to maintain those relationships post-incident? And then, of course, you have the quote-unquote cyber protection cost, which is where I spent a couple of years in the insurance industry, where you've got increased in premiums, the cost of making the organizational changes, the deployment of additional personnel, third parties, training employees, engaging third-party experts and consultants. These costs could be in the tens of millions of dollars. And then, of course, let's just call it as it is. I mean, what about the loss of revenue from whether it be an intellectual property theft, whether your inability to produce widgets and that are going to be sold? Unauthorized use of proprietary information is extremely lucrative for adversaries, particularly within certain countries that repurpose intellectual property for their own agenda. And then, some of the work that I've been kind of aligning to of recent is, understanding the litigation, legal risks, regulatory actions, and these legal costs could be in the billions of dollars. And in fact, so there were two, I won't name names, but there was a healthcare company and a consumer product company. And both had a business interruption event this calendar year. And both companies realized a $100 million write-down as a result. So that was like completely disclosed prior. So it's that type of enumeration of what those cost implications are that have either direct or indirect financial costs that can negatively influence the balance sheet of the company. And again, Matt, my concern is the CISO cybersecurity community. Their security operations centers are ill prepared with the tooling, the analytics, the expertise to help inform some of these decisions. And then you've got a four-day clock that's starting once to determine materiality. So I think this would be a wake-up call to action for us to level up our tooling in order to deliver this business and financial context.
Prisma Cloud secures infrastructure, applications, data, and entitlements across the world's largest clouds, all from a single unified solution. With a combination of cloud service provider APIs and a unified agent framework, users gain unmatched visibility and protection. Prisma Cloud also integrates with any continuous integration and continuous delivery workflow to secure cloud infrastructure and applications early in development. You can scan infrastructure as code templates, container images, serverless functions, and more while gaining powerful, full-stack runtime protection. This is unified security for DevOps and security teams. To find out more, go to prismacloud.io. So the items that you mentioned, I took some notes because a lot of the stuff is not stuff that I've been close to in my career, but the impact of the business. These are things that when I've worked in security programs, the programs themselves, in terms of the reporting that we do upwards, was always, like you said, very technically focused, like vulnerabilities, outstanding, how long, mean time to remediation, all those kind of very technically focused metrics. It sounds like you're saying that from a board perspective, and then as I guess it relates to the proposed rule, that the board is going to be probably not interested at all in those number of vulnerabilities, but they really want to understand just what is the impact to the business. So I guess my question to you is, you're right. Most tools that I've worked with over the years are, again, very kind of technically focused. They don't have insight into the business. In fact, this is one of the things I've seen, even when teams have gone out to make a proposal for, hey, this is why we want to make a 7-figure investment into this security tool. And someone says, well, hey, what's the ROI on it? They're like, you really can't show an ROI of a security tool, except we get that a whole debate. So I guess my question for you, Chris, is just, boards are looking for this. This is what boards are actually looking for. But it seems like what the language that most cybersecurity programs, quite frankly, that I've been a part of, they don't speak that language. How do you bridge that gap?
Yeah, it's an area, Matt, that I've been squarely focused on, and quite frankly, I struggled with while I was in the CISO role for GE Capital. And the metrics that we were delivering, and we still see this being delivered, to your point, are very technical nature. They're mean time to recover. It's basically blocking and tackling, such as patch time, remediation, deployment of specific controls, authentication measures. You pick a program, you receive the funding for the program, and your goal is to go from 0 to 100% over whatever, quarter over quarter. And so what we're seeing now is again, with the SEC ruling, and even if you take a step back, the global economy, the cost associated with cyber is just astronomical. It's some studies suggest through the World Economic Forum for the year for this calendar year, projected to cost the global economy $6 to $7 trillion, and that expected to grow in the order of $10 trillion over the next 5 years. So this is becoming increasingly a systemic risk across our society, across our economies. It's becoming an economic exposure. And with that, the boardroom and the C-suite and the regulators are going to require the delivery of this context in terms of what I call the so what factor. So, if we indicate these examples that I enumerated before, the potential cost and damage that can stem from material incidents, and to the extent that you're a small company that have been targets of cyber attacks so severe that the company, may go out of business as a result of it. So we really need to start to think about the direct and indirect financial cost to the company. And in the boardroom, my role with the boardroom as the National Association of Corporate Directors Advisor, we have about 25,000 members. And on an annual basis, we produce a number of surveys, everything from like ESG to transparency to ethics to governance principles. Cyber is always top three. And I'd say on average, last three and a half years, 70% of the boardroom community continue to assert that they don't understand what's being delivered to them in terms of cyber risk. There's too much uncertainty. And I've witnessed this just as sitting on dozens of boards as an advisor over quarterly basis. And so what we've decided to pursue is, okay, so how do we bring something that's more business context? What if we bring a level up, top-down analysis as to where the most material threats are going to manifest for this specific company that would have material financial harm, using a loss analysis very similar to how the cyber insurance industry operates, or the insurance industry as a whole. And we call this an annual expected loss analysis. Think of it as it's a compass, right? To say, hey, based on your business profile, based on historical activities, as well as how effective you are as a security organization. And you can pick the framework, whether it's CIS, NIST, CSF, ISO, pick the framework, but have an indication as to where you are from a maturity standpoint, and you blend that into how the risk transfer markets think about where those annual expected losses are. Now you've got a compelling story with the boardroom, and it's really about the financial exposure relative to those material threats that are going to have the most material impact to the financial condition of the company. And then more importantly, to what extent are you deploying capital investments and deployment of tooling in order to intercept those threats? So we launched this summer over the NACD, and we actually had a hard launch during the NACD Summit in October, the NACD Cyber Risk Reporting Service powered by X Analytics. And we looked at a wide range of tooling and capabilities, everything from outside-in vendors to scanning tools to network telemetry vendors to open source models where you do Monte Carlo simulation. Everything that we brought into the tent failed to deliver the efficient and sufficient insights. So our view on this is the true arbiter for cyber risk management are the risk transfer markets. So this analytics platform was built on the back of the cyber insurance industry. And it's helped to provide a directional guidance and compass as to where to deploy capital and in order to suppress that risk. And the opening salvo with the board is, you're a company of this size, you have this many assets, this many employees, you operate in these countries. Here's where you are from a maturity standpoint, because invariably a company has some level of security assessment, whether it's from a PricewaterhouseCoopers or a regulatory assessment. They're assessed to death, and we're able to back that into where those most likely threats are going to occur. And again, it's here's the range, right? You've got $100 million in unaddressed cyber risk. It can manifest into these quadrants or tranches. Ransomware, business interruption, intellectual property is an exposure to you, and based on these core risk exposures, here's where you should start to deploy capital. Maybe you're underinvested in response time. Maybe if uptime is most critical, then maybe you should be investing into quick, fast, efficient recovery from ransomware, where you've got pristine copies of data that are kept offline and are able to recover. You'll be amazed how many organizations don't take this risk-based approach to deploying investments in cybersecurity. We had one company that had a ransomware event. They are in the consumer manufacturing business. And when they looked at their policy, from an insurance standpoint, it was designed to protect against personal identifiable information loss. And, I questioned the risk manager and the CISO. I said, who thought of this policy? Well, we just kind of thought that was our biggest risk. The reality is that, you guys were down for 48 hours, and it's going to cost you about $25 million. The policy in reality should have been constructed to address for the downtime, right? Or for the outage. So it's aligning those budgets and those resources to suppress those risks in a material way.
So in your November of this year, 2022, there was a Harvard Business Review article that you authored with Dr. Carrie Perlson. And one of the things I pulled out that I think fits really well with what you just mentioned was it says this, quote, "Most organizations we've studied focus on cyber protection rather than cyber resilience. And we believe that is a mistake." So you mentioned the word resilience. Where does this all where does resilience, cyber resilience fit in with, let's bring this back to what's coming down the pike with kind of this potential SEC ruling? Where does that fit in? Because you're right. I think that even thinking through just the different organizations I've been through, there's probably been one or two that had any focus on resilience.
Yeah, it's a great question. And we're starting to hear resilience ring through the community, within the boardroom, within the enterprise risk management community, within the cybersecurity community. And what we're trying to achieve here is, let's get out of the right of boom, which is we're always responding to incidents, suppressing, putting out fires, and let's try to move left of boom, where we're identifying those threats that represent the most material impact, and we're proactively communicating with the boardroom, with the chief financial officer, the folks that hold the purse strings, to ensure that you're deploying capital in such a way that maintains business resilience. And when we think about resilience, it's, the analogy could be, hey, if we have a 48-hour outage as a result of downtime across these systems that support these business processes, you put that forward to the enterprise risk team. You make sure that you have legal, risk, the business owners involved, and you make some decisions around, is that acceptable? And if the answer is no, then let's talk about an acceptable level of downtime. The answer may be, hey, we can operate, without this capability for 12 hours, and it would only cost us, maybe a couple $1 million relative to, our $1 billion spend or our $1 billion exposure. Whatever it may be, it's getting to that calculation as to where you are relative to the the broad exposure. And then from there, you back into, okay, so if we're going to go, if 48 hours is not acceptable, let's now move the needle down to 12 hours. And now you've got a differential. And that's where you're going to build in your resiliency plan. You're going to make sure that if a business interruption event occurs, that all of your capital deployment, your backup plans, the way you recover data, is all aligned to maintain that resilience strength. And if you don't have the support from the people in the organization and you don't have the right technology deployed, then that is going to unfortunately impede your ability to maintain resiliency. So that's really about having that transparent conversation, bringing in the business, operational, financial context to the exposure, and then getting the support from the enterprise risk organization and the board. Once they say, hey, this is not acceptable, we can accept maybe 20% of the risk, but 80% needs to be addressed. Okay, so let's talk about how to transform the way we operate our business. Let's talk about the deployment of technology. Let's reevaluate our supply chain exposure and dependency. And these measures and the steps are eventually going to achieve some level of resiliency.
So let's go back to, I think it's proposed item 407, which is where it would require companies to annually disclose in their proxy statements for their annual meetings of shareholders, their cybersecurity expertise for the board of directors, if any. So on this specifically, we've been talking about resilience. We've been talking about just the need to actually speak business language. So I guess it's a couple questions. If this is going to cause public companies to seek more cyber experience directors for their board, how do you think as an industry we're going to bridge the gap where, again, you have a lot of CISOs that are very technical, right? They maybe came from a network security background, right? They kind of came up, building firewalls. And so they kind of have a very technical view of the cybersecurity world. And yet you're talking about the things that may end up in this SEC rule, which, today are kind of, like you said, it's kind of just guidance today. But when it becomes like, no, you have to do these things, how do we bridge that gap with cybersecurity leaders? Like, where do you start? Like, what should we be doing? Like, I guess as an industry and as leaders to, like, if we aspire to that someday, how do we get from being really good technically to just being able to speak in a way that's actually consumable by the business?
Yeah, so I have a viewpoint on that particular portion of the rule, in that it's impossible to fill every boardroom with cyber experts that are capable of understanding the completeness of business risk, regulatory risk, all the risk factors and the governance factors required to become and maintain an effective board member. The NACD does a good job at delivering an annual certification process through board readiness training, and they have various domains that companies and individuals should pursue if they aspire to be a board member. But again, cyber is only a sliver of the entirety of what it means to become and maintain as an effective board member. The other facet of this is, again, if you don't have the expertise dedicated to the board, you can augment it using a supplier, or we call it an outside advisor, right? Plenty of folks that are retired CISOs that have 25 plus years experience in industry, that perhaps have that business acumen and experience that can be delivered through some type of outside capability. And we're seeing this as a kind of a push, because to give up a board seat to a cyber expert is very precious, because again, you can't be the proverbial one-trick pony around understanding the technology. The other dimension to this, and which is kind of a negative consequence of having the quote-unquote designated CISO sitting on the board, is what I've seen is it continues to advance the ineffective communications in terms of delivering technology jargon into the boardroom. And so what happens is you have the technology expert, cyber expert on the board, you have the CISO reporting up to the board, and it becomes a one-to-one conversation. What I've observed is, once that agenda item is surfaced, the entirety of the board checks out, and you're not achieving proper governance, because again, you want to have the entire board locked in, understanding these risks. It can't be up to that one individual, and you're not able to deliver, unfortunately, the materiality decisioning, which is really about the alignment of cyber and technology risk to business operations and financial. So you kind of have to have this balancing act here. Perhaps for a critical infrastructure operator, the top 20 banking institution, you probably want that dedicated individual or perhaps an outside expert to augment some of that capability. But the conversation needs to be wholesome enough where the entirety of the board can enact proper governance. And again, if that technical conversation continues to persist, unfortunately, that's not going to address resiliency, because it's not going to. The board's not going to allocate dollars and funds because they're not going to understand how the risk is impacting their business, and it's not going to achieve the objective of what's stated within the SEC ruling. So, you can have that cyber expert, keep the conversation offline when it comes to technology, keep the metrics that are tactical in nature in the appendix of the report, but make sure that once you come into that boardroom, and whether it's reporting to the audit committee, to the risk committee, that you've got the entirety of the board locked and loaded and engaged on this conversation.
So the proposed rule would also require companies to disclose a lot of different facets of their cybersecurity policies and procedures. Like, one of the things I believe I pulled out was that, for example, are there procedures for overseeing the cybersecurity risk from the use of third-party service providers? So this is where I see cloud coming into the conversation, right? Where you mentioned also critical infrastructure operators, right? I don't know if the large CSPs, the three large CSPs, are designated as critical infrastructure yet, but certainly for many businesses that are operating majority of their compute there, they would certainly consider them that. Where does cloud come into all this?
Yeah, so the supply chain dependency and the cloud is part of that, that view on where enterprise risk can be impacted as a result of the dependencies on these third parties. So, early on, I mentioned the types of costs and adverse consequences that companies may incur or experience as a result of cyber risk or incidents. Apply that same list to your supply chain and make sure that you have, a solid understanding of, number one, where are your suppliers, what level of support are they providing? Are they, a core cloud provider, or is it a outsourced, operations center, outsourced call center, for instance? Whatever that supplier service may be delivering, it needs to be tied into your enterprise risk management function, because, we don't view, at least I don't view, and the industry doesn't view suppliers any different than an internal capability. All you're doing is outsourcing the capability, but you can't outsource the risk. And in the instance of the large cloud service providers, where it gets nuanced is, you've got kind of everything below the hypervisor level. So, we'll call it the data centers, for instance, the physical assets of these operators, they're typically evaluated through some level of standardization or some level of audit. And there's almost like a trust factor there that you've got to lean on, that they're operating their core infrastructure, their redundancy in such a way that it's meeting certain requirements, whether it be power, whether it be anything else on, for instance, network redundancy. But once you step above that hypervisor or the core infrastructure of the cloud provider, then it becomes your responsibility in terms of the management of the data, the ability to apply different types of controls. I've seen many cloud providers even offer additional cybersecurity services beyond just the core native, and unfortunately, those aren't well understood, and many companies kind of don't buy or level up their cybersecurity capabilities because they just inherently think that, hey, because I'm in the cloud, it's inherently secure. But the reality is that, if I'm doing, let's say, an upload, throwing up an instance for an online accounting capability for my business into AWS or any other cloud provider, they offer baseline security, but those aren't inherently configured. You have to deploy those configurations, no different than if you were to build an instance inside your organization. So just be mindful of the connectivity between cloud providers and supply chain as part of your organization, part of your enterprise risk. And look, if an incident occurs or unaddressed cyber risk exists, it's in the third-party ecosystem, that has to be part of your disclosure process.
So let's switch gears. When it comes to personal growth, what's the formula that works for you?
It's being your own critic. It's constantly evolving. That cybersecurity and other facets of just being, an executive, being a wholesome individual, never stops. Continue to learn. Be humble. Realize that you're not always the smartest person in the room. Listen is, in my mind, the most important communication skill. My theory is, if we're having a dialogue with an individual, a bunch of individuals, 70-80% of my time should be listening versus telling or advancing my agenda. And like I said, just continue to evolve and realize that we don't know it all, and we never will. And this is an evolving, complex space that needs to be tackled using full transparency, risk-based approach, and constant evolution and learning.
Well, Chris, those are some awesome words of wisdom. Thank you for sharing today. Thank you for talking about a lot of things that, I tell you what, I learned a lot in this podcast. So thank you so much for your time, and thanks for coming on the show.
Awesome, Matt. Thank you.
See you.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode. To find out more, please visit us at cloudsecuritytoday.com.